The letter that Paul wrote to the Christians in Rome was not the first epistle from his hand. In fact, the letter of Romans was actually dictated by Paul to a scribe who writes it down. Probably written somewhere between AD 56 and 58. It was written when he's getting ready to take that final journey to Jerusalem. He's in Greece when he writes it. Actually, it's written from Corinth. How do you know that? In part because of what he says. He gives indications in the way he words things that gives us a pretty good clue that it's Corinth. For example, in Romans chapter 16, down in verse 1, I commend to you Phoebe, our sister, who is a servant of the church in Cenchrea. Cenchrea is the seaport of Corinth. He also mentions in verse 23, Gaius, my host, and the host of the whole church greet you. Gaius, my host. Where have we heard that name before? It shows up in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. I thank God that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius, lest anyone should say that I baptized in my own name. Gaius is an individual that is a resident of Corinth. He also mentions someone else back in Romans chapter 16. That same verse, Gaius, my host, and the host of the whole church greet you. Erastus, the treasurer of the city. Erastus. That name comes up as well in what Paul writes to Timothy in 2 Timothy in the 4th chapter. Erastus, verse 20, stayed in Corinth. So here's the letter that Paul writes to a Christian he has not yet met in the city of Rome. He is still in the country of Greece. He's in Corinth. He's getting ready to set sail for Jerusalem. He indicates that within the writing of the letter to these Roman Christians. He's endeavoring to go to Jerusalem with this gift for those that are suffering through a famine. He wants to come back to them, hoping to spend time with them. Chapter 15 of Romans, this is what he says. Now, no longer having a place in these parts, verse 23, and having a great desire these many years to come to you in Rome, whenever I journey to Spain, I shall come to you, for I hope to see you on my journey and to be helped on my way there by you, if first I may enjoy your company for a while. But now I'm going to Jerusalem to minister to the saints. He talks about the Greeks in Macedonia actually having a contribution that they have gathered for the saints in Jerusalem. Down in verse 28, therefore, when I have performed this and have sealed to them this fruit, this contribution, I shall go by way of you to Spain. He's on his way to give that relief, to provide that relief that's been accumulated for those Christians going through that famine. But later on that journey, he finds that, okay, when you get to Jerusalem, you're going to be arrested. When he's writing this letter from Corinth to the Christians in Rome, what does he say? What's the purpose? What does he mention? From a purpose standpoint, down in verse 14, he says, I am a debtor to Greeks and to the barbarians, both to the wise and to the unwise. Verse 5, so as much as in me is, I'm ready to preach the gospel to you who are in Rome also. His purpose, he always sees himself as a debt, having a debt to return. God's been so gracious to him, and he's trying to share that message as far and wide as he possibly can. But not just that I'm a debtor, I am ready to preach the gospel. I'm prepared. And that preparation standpoint of Paul's life is something that is in evidence everywhere that he goes. But he mentions something else. He mentions something in verse 16. I'm not ashamed. I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first, and also for the Greek. I am a debtor. I'm prepared to proclaim that message, and there's nothing about that message of which I am ashamed. I'm going to be bold about making use of every opportunity that I have to proclaim that message. In verse 17, the righteousness of God is revealed in it from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. It's a quotation out of an Old Testament prophet, the book of Habakkuk, chapter 2 and verse 4. And what it says is that life action is always in connection with what one believes. The just shall live by faith. Action is involved. It's not something that's some kind of subtle kind of idea that's in the back of my mind that has no connection with what I do or how I conduct myself. Living by faith is an action that I undertake whereby I am endeavoring to follow those precepts of God no matter what happens in my life. And Paul starts by pointing that out in this particular situation. So there's the positive of chapter 1. I'm a debtor. I want to visit with you. I'm a debtor to the Greeks, to everyone. I'm prepared with that message, and I'm not ashamed of that message because that is a message whereby we can have our sins forgiven and be a part of the family of God. People have gotten away from that, however, and beginning in verse 18, all the way down through the end of chapter 1, he enumerates a lot of negative things that people have been involved in that first century and people are still involved in today, that often clouds their view from what true Christianity really needs to be. But that's another topic for another time. Please stay safe. We'll talk again soon.